Thank you, Julia, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all of you for coming here. And many of you might have read the abstract that I prepared for this talk today, but I also ended up writing a whole article that I've just posted on Medium literally an hour ago. And you can see the link from my Twitter feed, and you might want to go back to it later because you're eating, of course. But I tell you about it because as I was preparing for this talk, my goal was to collect some real evidence, and in the process of doing that, I found myself writing almost like a research article, so it had to go in written form, and you want to go back to it for all the links that I've provided there and all the references. And what I will do now is essentially talk through that article that I wrote for this and provide some of the salient features and salient studies that I highlighted there. And this comes from when I was asked to do this talk. I was thinking about what are important things that have happened recently that on the topic of diversity and inclusion sort of trigger something in me and in many others in this community. And so I thought back that now in July is exactly 1 year after the Google memo, the anti-diversity, Google's Ideological Echo Chamber or whatever, something like that is called. It has its own Wikipedia page, fascinating read. That was exactly a year ago. And only a few days ago, a couple of weeks, 3 weeks ago maybe, we had another not so wildly viral article, much more restrained, but equally problematic. It was an article published by a lecturer in University of Washington in computer science, who teaches actually the introduction to computer science courses. His op-ed was titled "Why Women Don't Code." So his conclusion was, well, they just don't want to. And in summary, you can read the whole thing if you're interested. So with those two frames of reference, I found myself, well, you know, these diversity manifestos that keep popping up, I need to collect myself and collect some of the real evidence here to sort of be prepared the next time this conversation occurs in the hallway, because I have had encounters with my own colleagues when they use some of these arguments against our diversity efforts. So the first thing that I want to point out is a study. So, you know, responding to this university lecturer's op-ed, "Why Women Don't Code," there's a study, in fact, that shows, and this is the title of the study, that science faculties have a subtle gender bias that favor male students. This study, it is a randomized, double-blind study, properly done, of faculty who were presented with the application materials of a student, and they were randomly assigned either a male name or a female name. Same application materials. Evaluating these applicants for a lab position, they were undergraduate students supposedly applying for a lab position. These faculty members rated male applicants as more competent, assigned them a higher starting salary, and offered them more career mentoring as well. Identical application materials, I have to repeat because there's already a reply on my Twitter feed saying, oh, well, if one is more competent, then it's all fair. Identical application materials, I'll repeat. Both male and female faculty were equally biased against the female applicant. We're talking about a study involving 127 professors in biology, chemistry, physics across the country at all sorts of levels of tenure and so on. And they rated the student applications using a validated scale of competence and employability, and they selected a starting salary. The mean starting salary of the female applicants was $3,730 lower. This is a student, remember. For the female applicant, it's a 12% difference. The female student was also less likely to be hired, was viewed as less competent, and faculty of any gender, age, field, or tenure status showed the same trend. So it's a fact, empirical evidence shows that science faculty discriminate against female students. Now, I'll make a side note here. I'm focusing in this discussion on gender bias. That's out of personal interest. But some of the points I make are applicable to other dimensions of diversity and inclusion. I simply chose to focus in my closest group of identity. Now, students, on the other hand, are biased against female professors. In universities, you know, for the most part, the one tool that is used to assess teaching effectiveness of faculty is the student teaching evaluations. These surveys not only fail to reflect teaching effectiveness, but they are significantly biased against female instructors. So there is a study, a very recent study, that analyzed data sets from a natural experiment in a French university and a controlled randomized trial in a US university. The first data set included 6 first-year courses, 4,400 students over that 5 years. It's like many thousands of student responses that were analyzed. And the second study included 43 surveys of 4 sections in an online course. These researchers used advanced statistical analysis, non-parametric permutation analysis, statistical tests of significance. It's a serious study. And the authors found a weak and statistically insignificant association between the student rankings of the instructors and their performance in an anonymously graded exam. In other words, the student ratings don't reflect teaching effectiveness. They're just not associated. The students are just not able to assess teaching effectiveness in their surveys. They do, however, show a statistically significant association with instructor gender. Both at the French and US universities, the students favor male instructors. And in fact, in the US study, interestingly enough, because it was an online study, there were 4 groups of discussion, and there were 2 different teaching assistants assigned to these, and the teaching assistants swapped names in a pair of courses. And the data show that the students rate instructors significantly higher when they perceive them to be male, even in objective attributes like, are they prompt in returning the homework? So fact. There are dozens of studies that show that student teaching evaluations are biased against female instructors. And I've provided in the Medium post a link to a Google Doc where I've collected 24 or more peer-reviewed articles that provide this evidence. And I also included a video embedded there of Professor Philip Stark at UC Berkeley, who has contributed to some of these studies and actually gave an invited lecture at UC Berkeley in the Center for Studies in Higher Education, providing the arguments. Okay, students also underestimate the academic performance of their female peers. A study in college-level biology course, it's a topic where there's gender parity in biology. It's not like physics, where you might find much more male students. They found that the male students are more likely to be named by their peers as being knowledgeable on their course. So it's kind of like a popularity contest, right? Who is the most knowledgeable student in your class? They did these surveys throughout the course, like over time, and the study uses some longitudinal social network analysis, and they found that peers' perception of the higher knowledge of their male peers persists even after controlling for the actual performance of the students in the course, and also controlling for the students' outspoken personality. So this bias, in fact, does specifically reflect the students overestimating, the male students overestimating other male students by an amount which corresponds more or less to 0.6 grade point average in a 4-point scale. So the authors conclude that this uneven peer perception by gender are social factors that could negatively affect women's professional confidence, contributing perhaps to attrition in STEM careers. Now, these are students, so I've progressed from professors to students against professors and students against themselves, but we could continue on. We got a bit tired there collecting these examples. There are, in fact, biased peer assessments that continue throughout women's career as they progress. Peer review of publications, conference submissions, review of conference submissions, grant proposal reviews. In fact, I tweeted only a few days ago that men have statistically significant greater odds of receiving grants than women by about 7%, and there's a peer-reviewed study there that provides evidence to that. And of course, even code review and Pull requests in open source software, these are all rife with implicit bias against women. I provide a list there, a bullet list of about 6 links to other articles, but so that you can read some more about that if you want to educate yourselves about this. Peer review, all right. So the fact is, peer groups at all levels of science and technology show implicit bias against women. All right, let's switch a little bit to a related topic, given the arguments given by this lecturer on his op-ed, Why Women Don't Code, and focus a bit on occupational gender segregation. Think about, the beginning of the 20th century. At that time, less than 1 in 5 women held paid employment. By 1940, this had risen to about 27%, and American women older than 16 were working for wages in a rate of 55% by 1986. And it kind of stayed steady. It rose up to 60% and then dropped a little bit, and it's now 57% in last year. This is the statistics from the census. But as women moved into the labor market during the 20th century, women and men have always been segregated by occupation. There are economic indices that can be used to measure segregation, and these have been used in several studies, to provide an idea of the aggregate level of occupational sex segregation. And they show that it stays the same at about until from the beginning of the 20th century until 1970, flat, very segregated. In the decade of the 70s, so between 1970 and 1980, there was some increase of decrease of segregation, or increased integration. And as women started to integrate in jobs that were previously dominated by men. So also consider that the percentage of men in the the percentage of women in the labor market increased a bit as well. So from 38% women in the labor market to 42% in that decade. And in that decade, about 36 occupations saw a disproportionate increase in the representation of women. These include all sectors, like in the service sector, bus drivers and bartenders, and in the administrative sector, buyers and accountants, public relation professionals, also advertising area, and notably also computer operators, which were at the time characterized by the institutions of government as clerical occupants, the ones that write, the job distinctions. There's an official list of jobs, occupations that are counted. At that time, 1970, most women, 1970, were occupied in clerical positions, or service positions, or semi-professional jobs, and computing provided like a very unique opportunity to do technical work or some professional work. But the sector was also vertically segregated. So the number that we see is aggregated across all the computational occupations, but this number was 59%, so it sounds like women had good participation in computational jobs at the time. But the vertical segregation is like this. The representation was very high in data entry, 92% were women. It was very low in computer programming, 31%, and systems analysis, 23%. So you see another axis there of segregation by rank. Besides the segregation by rank, the salaries of computer operators in that decade rose more slowly than inflation. And so that led to men leaving the field, which explains somewhat the increase in representation of women in computing jobs. And as the field professionalized, the participation of women in computer science increased steadily. Computer science bachelor's degrees, computer science education, increased steadily, peaking at about 37% in 1984. This is a well-shared graphic that was included, I think, by the computer science professors in his op-ed. And then it starts to fall. After 1984, it starts to fall, dipping to an 80%. 80% of computer science bachelor's degrees are women. And that was in 2014. I think it's about the same right now. Some have tried to explain this effect as, families purchasing, as the early personal computers hit the market, families purchasing personal computers for men rather than for boys rather than girls, because they were marketed, they were very, very gendered in terms of the marketing of personal computers at the time in the 80s. But there's a group in Stanford that reports on efforts, their own efforts, to increase the number of women in the major, that they point to a different chain of events. At the time, universities were lacking faculty in computer science departments, and they took a number of steps to reduce enrollments. Among them, admission became more competitive, mathematics requirements were hardened, and introductory courses in computer science became the dreaded weed-out type of courses. All these types of measures disproportionately discourage women and minorities, as we know. I have a paragraph as well in my article, and I wanted to address this issue of intrinsic sex differences in ability because it's popped out in these manifestos, especially the Google Bro. The latest study that we have available on the question of differences in ability, mathematical ability in particular, was published just this year, in fact only a few weeks ago. It looks at young children under the age of 8, which has the purpose of trying to extract the cultural effects a little bit, although it starts very early, and it found no statistical differences in mathematical ability between girls and boys. Now, lack of significant difference is insufficient to conclude that the two groups are equivalent, right? It's just the way that these tests of hypotheses work. But this study, unlike predecessors, did also include a test of equivalence in performance, it's called, and also a test of statistical difference in variability. And that is important because many of the things that we hear quoted refer to a difference in variability, explaining there being more men in the long tails of highly performing or lower performing. There's no difference in variability according to the latest study. Longitudinal study involving more than 500 children. But adult differences in perceived ability or developed skill in science and mathematics are a very complex interplay of sociocultural effects. They cannot be ascribed to intrinsic biological differences. There's cultural stereotypes, parental guidance, teacher encouragement, social expectations, later life discrimination, of course, we've already talked about, and these all strongly shape the abilities and performance in STEM fields. So let's turn to diversity and inclusion. And I have a few interesting quotes here. One is the one that appeared in an email that I received from a conference organizer when I pointed out that all the plenary speakers were men. He said, "I am completely opposed to any positive discrimination." I'm sure many of you have heard such things. I had a colleague that after I presented in a faculty retreat a small presentation about gender balance in engineering at the request of my chair, said, "I am firmly opposed to quotas." Right there in front of everyone. And we've kind of heard that before, and it seems like it might be fair, yes, with this idea of quotas, we have a reaction to that. There's a common wisdom that they might be unfair. Okay, let's discuss this a little bit. Now, we know that diversity and inclusion concerns are now at least in the radar of across academia and industry. At the very least, institutions are expected to conduct some implicit bias training in their hiring committees, in their management levels, and perhaps compile a diversity report, do a survey on internal surveys of climate and demographics. It's kind of the minimum bar. Beyond that, any initiative that approaches affirmative action is really contentious. Sadly, many leaders also at institutions are not really committed and just want to check the box. And in addition to that, numerous individuals, often privileged, hold strong beliefs about diversity and inclusion without a basic understanding about the social justice concepts that underpin it all. Implicit bias has to be understood as a social justice issue first, before any training is going to be effective. Unfortunately, though, these training events do raise awareness of implicit bias, but many are not effective at changing behavior. In fact, many implicit bias trainings backfire. In fact, this Google Manifesto author felt exasperated enough after attending an implicit bias training event to write his piece. It was what prompted him to do it. That's the backfire. I've posted a link there to Brian Nosek. He's a well-known professor in psychology, and he has a student who published a thesis recently showing that most trainings really have not been systematically evaluated, and with a few exceptions, and the available evidence suggests that they can change awareness, but they do not change the actual behavior. So we have a long way to go. This implicit bias trainings thinks they can go really wrong. I've included a link there to a person who is a professional in this field. She has another Medium post titled How Not to Suck at Unconscious Bias Training. And her first point is to always come back to the fact that implicit bias has to be understood as a social justice issue first. The why. Why are we here? Needs to be the first question to address. Otherwise, you will get pushback from the people in the room who are not members of those groups and have been grown accustomed to the privilege. It's just human nature. They're nice people. They could be nice people, but they're used to their privileges. We can't hold it against them. We just need to educate them. Now, I do want to add a word about quotas, and this is such a misunderstood intervention. Almost always, the response to the mere mention of gender quotas is an argument about meritocracy. We can't lower the bar. Now, let's clear this up. Merit is a fallacy. Education, hiring, promotion, pay, elected officials, none of this are meritocratic. There's a professor in the UK, Rainbow Murray, who's been studying this, and she wrote an article on gender quotas in politics, in particular for the blog of London School of Economics, and I've included a link to that. And she says, judgments on quality and merit tend to be based on the status quo. And the defenders of this merit argument are implicitly, without knowing, really arguing for the preservation of the status quo. Objective measures of merit don't exist. They're just a reflection of what we see among us, or other groups see among them as what they respect, which perpetuates the patterns of segregation. What does exist is research evidence that quotas raise quality, contrary to common wisdom. Think about it. If implicit bias prevents us from making objective assessments of the capabilities and the work of others, and equally qualified men and women are perceived differently, then making a correction for gender bias raises the bar. The evidence. There's one study published in Science, I give the reference, that found that competition in sports scenarios enhanced the performance of boys while it reduced the performance of girls. And the hypothesis follows from that study that competition may lead to reduced participation by women. This hypothesis is tested in another study where affirmative action changed the applicant pool by increasing the participation of high-performing women. A professor in Norway, who's written quite a lot about this topic, explained these two studies in detail and what they mean and their implications. Affirmative action in a competition scenario, think of hiring, we could talk about hiring competitions, increases the talent in the participant group as more highly qualified women enter the competition. There's another study in Sweden that looks at zipper quotas. Zipper quotas are when you, in this case, was municipal politics, and they were looking, the parties alternated between men and women on the ballot. That's a zipper quota. They found that this measure raised the quality of the men who were elected and the quality of the group overall. So Professor Kurt Rice's conclusion, mediocre men were replaced by more highly qualified women. So the anti-quota argument is that they are unfair. But what they are, in fact, is an intervention to fix already unfair situations. And they raise overall quality. So next time you hear your colleague says that he's completely opposed to quotas, have these links handy. Backlash. Let's talk a little bit more about the backlash. I found this fascinating. So imagine this. You see an ad for a girls' night out dance party. Sounds like fun, right? Going dancing in a club, all girls, you don't have to worry about anybody groping you or anybody like just trying to buy you a drink and just bothering you. You can just dance. Sounds fun. In August 2017, this event in Oceanside, California filled up 5 weeks in advance. A man showed up at the door, however, and after he was denied entry, he sued for sex discrimination. This man has filed more than 24 lawsuits for discrimination. And in fact, there's a series of lawsuits in California that are weaponizing the local laws for discrimination, the Unraw Civil Rights Act, to silence women's empowerment initiatives. So it's a modus operandi of the members of the National Coalition for Men. For example, there's many of these men's rights activist groups, and they are using sex discrimination laws against empowerment, and they're also trying to silence any efforts. There's another one, it's really interesting. Ladies Get Paid is a company that organizes workshops and coaching events, and they had to settle a sex discrimination lawsuit because once you're faced with a sex discrimination lawsuit, you're facing crippling legal fees, and they just had to settle this when a man turned up at an event, got turned away, and then sued. So that's the extreme end of the backlash against gender equality interventions, but on the subtle side is simply denial. Particularly within the sphere that I'm interested in academia, it's most concerning that male faculty just don't believe implicit bias research. And there's an empirical study to prove it. An empirical study with groups from the general public and university faculty found that men evaluate the quality of the research on bias as low, much lower than women in their assessment. Despite their scientific training, on the face of empirical evidence about gender bias, they just refuse to be convinced by it. So the worst part, men faculty in STEM showed greater difference with women in their assessment of this research. Men faculty in STEM remain skeptical of implicit bias research even when faced with the evidence. So I've taken a first step here to collecting evidence. I hope these links are going to be useful to you, but you still face an uphill battle. And I collected finally a few rebuttals that I wanted to make to the particular two authors of this anti-diversity manifesto. The Google guide wrote, women generally have a stronger interest in people rather than things relative to men. And the University of Washington lecturer wrote, women simply choose to pursue other interests. And this suggestion that occupational gender segregation reflects the choices that women make is very common. You'll hear this a lot. And it often comes with the premise that there's some fundamental differences that lead to those choices. Now, if that were the case, then we would not see the counterexample of a rapid desegregation of certain occupations, like, for example, medicine. The fraction of medical school graduates who were women rose very rapidly from 16% in 1975 to 40% in just 20 years. Women's interest in the profession changed. Perhaps the medical system itself changed to be more welcoming to women. I don't know. But people's interests and choices are not innate. They have their origins in culture and society. There's one response that I found to the lecturer's op-ed that points to scientific evidence showing that the culture of a learning community is what determines their interests in joining it. This has a lot of implications for us as well. The culture, I will repeat, of a learning community is what determines the interests of people in joining it. The science of human development has established already that people don't choose their interests and occupations freely. Experience, economic opportunities, social expectations, parental guidance, cultural pressures, all these really govern our choices. Then some of the responses to these anti-diversity pieces, one Reddit commenter said, women are underrepresented among roofers, they're only 0.6%, by 2 orders of magnitude more than CS. Why so much attention on CS? Another commenter on the Quillette piece said, men are underrepresented in many fields: social work, education, psychology, healthcare, and veterinary medicine. Where's all the hand-wringing about how men are being excluded? Okay. Occupational gender segregation is one of the leading factors in the wage gap. So desegregating high-paying, high-demand occupations is a social justice concern. Don't tell me it's easy to be a nurse or high-paying. Additionally, researchers now recognize a form of sex discrimination that is very hard to decipher, very hard to explain. Jobs filled predominantly by men have higher wages than jobs filled predominantly by women, even when the skill, effort, and education are comparable. This is called the principle of comparable worth. There's books written about this. And an example of comparable worth disputes that are provided in the reference that I included in my article to go with this talk is, for example, in 1975, nurses sued the city of Denver because their wages were lower than tree trimmers or sign painters in the Denver city employment. You would say the amount of work or the skill level, certainly there you have an argument that there's a injustice there in terms of wages. There's another example. The California School Employees Association complained in 1985 about librarians and teaching assistants, who were mostly women, being paid less than men custodians and groundkeepers. So there are really concrete examples to this principle of comparable worth. Opposite examples where male occupations are paid less for comparable skill and effort are simply rare or inexistent. A separate factor from comparable worth is hiring discrimination against women seeking to enter predominantly male occupations. And evidence of discrimination in hiring and promotion has accumulated from various empirical studies using all sorts of randomized trials. And anticipating more discrimination in some occupations, women alter their choices. It's natural. So at this point, collecting all of this, I got really depressed and really sad. I ran out of steam, and I decided to write all this up to share with everybody. And I don't have an insight on what to do, except to become more educated and be ready with the evidence the next time somebody says, I'm completely opposed to affirmative action. I want to mention that we had a discussion, I saw a discussion in the Slack channel about our initiative in the conference to be conscious of the fact that when we have a Q&A after a talk, there's some research that says that if the first question is raised by a woman or non-male participant, that the turnout of questions turns out to be much more diverse. And I saw that there was some backlash to that on Slack. I want to tell you all, that's normal. That's our reaction. We think it's unfair. This is the same thing that applies to quotas. Our reaction, it's common sense to not, it's going to create another privileged group, it's going to silence the other group. We're not doing that. We are trying to correct for things that, according to evidence, has silenced some groups. We might not be immediately smooth and graceful at doing that. If we talk about it and hash it out, we might improve. But let's use this as an example of how the immediate reaction will be pushback when you try to correct any of these biases in our society. We have to be ready for that. We have to be ready with arguments and with evidence and listen to each other. But even in the most evolved communities, and I consider this a very evolved community, we will have these awkward moments, and we can only get through them by talking to each other and pulling the evidence whenever it's there for us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know the organizers here what their plan was, or whether they wanted to have Q&A or something, or what the time is looking like. Who is... if you want to make a comment or ask a question, I'm happy to accommodate. Okay. Let me share the mic with you. Yeah, you just pass it over? We'll just share. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorena. I really appreciated your talk. I actually work in healthcare. I'm a physical therapist, and I took up Python because I wanted to analyze my research data, and I just want to encourage all of you the positive changes I've seen in healthcare in the emergency department, because we have an ever-increasing amount of women in medicine and men in nursing, and the team aspects are really encouraging, and the pay is better for everyone, and people seem genuinely happier than when I go upstairs to the hospital floors where most nurses are still women. I just notice big differences in how that helps the overall flow and efficiency in our department, and I have no doubt, I'm not a great programmer yet, but I have no doubt that the same can be true of your field. So I understand where some of those men were coming, or anyone posting on Slack came from, because that was my initial thought too. I'm like, why should the first question, that seems unfair that they would say, oh, actually we want to pick you to speak first. But then you helped me to reconsider that even as a woman, sometimes I'm nervous about quotas, and that I maybe need to reconsider that evidence. So stay the course. And I have to say, compared to any physical therapy or medicine conference that I've been to, this group is more welcoming even than that. So I say there's a lot of hope, and you're all lovely people. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. I don't know if else wants to.
Thank you, Lorena. I want to ask your perspective about how you navigate conflicting approaches to removing bias. So to take a specific example around proposal review, you could either have some kind of affirmative approach or remove identifying information. And I'm somewhat invested in this question because I've had a lot of debate about this among Pi data committees. So your thoughts?
I'm not an expert in that question, but I just have opinions, as we all do. Participating in peer review myself as a scientist, I have found that double-blind is very difficult to achieve. It's just very difficult. I participated in a conference that had double-blind review as a reviewer, and I reviewed, 10 papers, full-length papers. In every case except 2, I knew who the authors were within 5 minutes of Googling. Not because I wanted to, but because I wanted to do my peer reviewing properly, and I wanted to see the related literature, and our minds are fantastic at connecting the dots. So the patterns emerge pretty clearly, and you suspect with a very high level of confidence who the people. Now, the other opinion I have about double-blind is that it's a Band-Aid, okay? It's like we're going to recognize that we're not able to behave well, so we're going to put you in a situation where you're not able to behave badly, right? Instead of trying to attack the root problem, which is recognizing the bias, trying to educate people, and correcting the course, which is going to take time and is going to be painful, but at the end of the day, we're not putting our head in the sand and trying with double-blind to just let bias continue its course but not affect us. I don't think really that's, in the long term, the constructive thing to do. It might be necessary in some scenarios, and so nothing, I don't think there's a rule. In some scenarios, maybe you do need double-blind, like they have proved very effective in auditions for orchestra positions. But if you put a violin playing behind a curtain, it really is impossible to know who they are. But if you're doing peer review in a very specialized field, the chances of double-blind succeeding are difficult. So I would prefer to go the opposite way, double open, fully transparent. If somebody is actually applying their biases in the review, eventually, if everything is sufficiently transparent, it should come to the surface, and there should be some cultural way of improving that, in my opinion. Yeah. Now, affirmative action in some cases might be necessary, and we just need to have the stomach for it, because it is an intervention to make where unfair situations already exist. So if we've identified an unfair situation and this can immediately correct it, we might have to do it. Yeah.
Hi. Okay, so I just have a suggestion. So I'm a data scientist at Roche Sequencing Solutions, and last year, the women in our company, we created a committee called the Roche Women in Leadership. And this has really been very empowering for women and for minorities, and it's a great way of educating the community around us, and to have men as allies, and to be able to make it clearer with numbers and with ways of empowering and sharing what exactly is going on. So just a suggestion maybe to bring to your own communities as well, something like this.
So I wanted to go back to this backlash thing, and this is concerning here. That's why I thought it's important to bring it up back. Is when someone said that it's not quite empowering when someone says that women should be the first one to ask question. You can give me a perspective on that, but I think when you're trying to do something good for women and some of the group think that this is not empowering for them, we should, rather than calling that a backlash, we should step back and try to understand what would they want instead, because I'm sure they understand there is a good intention, but we haven't lived their lives. Maybe they have better solution than we can identify. Yeah, just wanted to add that.
The key is listening, and I think I said those words, listening. Listening to each other, yes.
Thanks. Thank you, Lorena. That was a great talk. I think that one thing that you said in the talk really jumped out at me, and that was the talk about the quotas. People talk about that. And I think we have something to learn from climate science. Do you remember when people started saying, I don't believe in climate change? And when that first started happening, I thought, ooh, wrong category. You know, it's not a belief. But we have a real problem in the climate science community that's along those lines. And the more evidence that you pile on, the less people change their beliefs, and they hold on to their beliefs even more strongly. And there's a lot of people in the climate science community who are looking at this and who are trying to find alternative ways, and I think it really comes down to human psychology and how we hold beliefs, and the fact that we don't base a lot of our decisions on things that are logical at all. And there's a lot of people that are doing research into how to do that, and I think that's the next step that we need to take.
Yeah, just another comment about the backlash. I don't think for me at least, it's not about the quotas and the giving the first thing to speaker. I actually think that's a great idea. I just thought making it public would generate this backlash, which would not have happened at all otherwise. And that was my only objection. It's not at all to the, and I don't know if that didn't come through from whether you, and that's fine. I totally appreciate what you all do.
Oh.
Thank you for your talk. I think I have a point related to the previous question the lady asked about evidence, and I want to hear your opinion. I think it's a difficult question because you say you're giving a paper, and I would actually like to know where I can see that after. And the studies are there, and you talk about you need to have the evidence and the data. But the point is that the data is not actually so obvious what the conclusion is. When you look at data, sometimes obvious, sometimes it's not. And I think the previous comment was about how people would come up with their data, and they will to support their beliefs. So how do you answer that? I mean, there's numerous studies that have been debunked, right? And there's like a ton of experiments with significant results that show all sorts of crazy things, not outside gender bias or anything related, but just unbelievable things. So how do you react with that, and how do you kind of deal with that when I can bring evidence, but the other person can bring other evidence, and at the end of the day, it's like no, it doesn't end.
Right, so does drinking wine increase your chances of getting cancer or decrease it? Is dark chocolate good for your health or bad for your health? Is coffee good for you or bad for you? I mean, we see these things going up and down in the media all the time, and that reduces our confidence in the scientific method. Yes, what can I say? I mean, people don't understand the scientific method. Studies do get not debunked, but one thing is to debunk something. I believe the word debunk seems to say that the original person intended to deceive, and we have found them in their deception. It's not the same when a scientific study has flaws or insufficient data to make a conclusion, or is misinterpreted by the general public and the media, which is most often what's happening, because many times scientists are actually making quite appropriate conclusions with the data that they have. And I'm not talking about data analysis. I think you had a little bit of when you were talking about data, I think that you were thinking a little bit from the point of view of data analysis, data science, because of the crew here. But these studies that we're talking about are randomized, the gold standard, right? Randomized controlled trials, where you calculate the statistical significance, the size of the effect, and several statistical analysis. It's a kind of a different beast. In any case, often what happens is when these things get interpreted by the PR person of the university and the media people, they get amplified with the wrong conclusions, and then they get debunked because, yes, it was the PR person that actually wrote a causality there when there was not really anything more than a statistically significant association. So that is a big problem. We have to educate the public more about how science works. And we have to remain skeptic and go back to the source. That's what I always tell my students. Go back to the source. If you read that's what I did for this piece. I actually read those papers. I did not repeat what somebody else said about the papers. I read the whole paper and said, what is this author really saying? What is this experiment? And I was confident to say when I told you that this study shows evidence of this particular association because I read the paper. So beyond that, I don't know.
Okay, trying to pick something, One more? Okay, so maybe one more question.
We can continue talking.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I completely agree with you that scientific evidence is there. There's a scientific method. It's undeniable. But to the point that the lady made about climate science, there's human psychology involved. And one well-known psychological effect that happens is cognitive dissonance. This is when I have two conflicting beliefs, then one way of dealing with that is to completely reject one of them, even though if there's evidence. Like climate change, that's one very clear example of that. Or one example that I like to use is, for example, eating animals. Like people say they love animals, but then they also eat them. There's a cognitive dissonance there. That's why it's so hard to talk about that topic. And For example, climate change. Like, I love driving cars. Like, I need my car to sustain my family. Oh, but the car's destroying the planet. I like the planet too. So it's not as easy as just saying. I completely agree with you. Like, as a scientist, I have no question that is true. But for some people, that there is this cognitive dissonance is very strong, and I agree that the challenge here is human psychology, and it's not just mustering up the evidence. So thank you for your talk, by the way. It was really amazing. Thank you.
Okay.
The chair of the conference has a final word.
Yeah.
So I might as well stand up and do this. This is mostly about the thing that I said the first day. I just wanted to give an unconditional apology in case I offended anyone. I did that on the diversity Slack channel. But in case I did put people on the spot, that was definitely not the intent. So I just wanted to give an unconditional apology in case anyone felt offended. And I'm not going to justify or say anything, to take anything away from that apology. The second thing I wanted to mention was, I think there's some element of compassion that's extremely important on both sides. Because as a man, there are certain things I don't understand. The best person who teaches me about that is my wife. And she tells me a lot of things saying, hey, you don't understand this. Yeah, and it's real. And some of these, absolutely. She's changed a lot of my perceptions about things that I never understood, because as a man, I do not understand what it means to be, insecure all the time, especially in a country like a very crowded country like India. It is difficult because there are horrible things that happen to people. And we don't understand it. But some of us are trying to change, and we're trying to say, hey, we want to make things better. And we're going to make mistakes. I'm human too, right? I have my own privileges that I have, and there are some privileges I do not have. I am a person of color in this country. I come from a third world country, so-called. So everybody's facing their own problems. So all I'm trying to say is, this is one community where I've found people to be almost, everybody I've seen has been like wonderful. They've been just amazing. So I think some element of compassion helps both ways to make both of us become better. Because if I'm trying to become better, I know I'm going to make mistakes. And even if I'm trying to do something good sometimes, I do something wrong. And so my apologies for that, but I'm trying to learn as well. So I think some element of compassion will also make me feel less scared the next time I do something and take an initiative. If I take a step forward, I shouldn't be scared about standing up and saying something just because I'm going to feel, oh my God, people are going to feel upset about it. So once again, an apology and a request for some compassion. Thank you.